The Green Party is running candidates in 71 out of BC's 75 ridings in this election, and yet the Greens complain that they've been elbowed out of the media spotlight by the so-called mainstream established parties. Well, if you believe that election campaigns ought to be about an exchange of ideas about the future, then you want to stay tuned for the next 30 minutes. Welcome to our 5th Voters Forum. Tonight, the leader of the Green Party, Stuart Parker. And asking the questions, our perhaps by now familiar group of 8 voters from across BC, beginning with James Shea, an accounting professor from Richmond. Miel Chandler is a student and single mom living in East Vancouver. Tom Spring is a retired high school principal from Matsqui. Rhonda Third sells real estate in Campbell River. Balbir Gurm is a nursing instructor who lives in Surrey. Tam Tran is a youth counselor in New Westminster. Don Gemmell lives in Powell River, where he is a business consultant. And Marianne Bennett has retired in Victoria. And we'll be back with our first question to the leader of the Green Party, Stuart Parker, in just a moment. Welcome to our 5th Voters Forum. One of the things that many voters have been telling us here at the CBC is that elections should be about the future. And many of you want to hear what the Green Party has to say, and Stuart Parker, the leader of the Green Party, is here tonight for the next 20 minutes talking to 8 voters to elaborate on what the Green Party is all about. Let's go to the questions right now, beginning with Tom Spring.
Stuart, by your own words, you indicated that at one time there was a question as to whether or not the Green Party was a true political party. And, you know, I think that there have been a lot of changes that have taken place in the interim. But still the question is in my mind and in the mind of many voters as to why the Green Party exists, other than to high profile, the fact that environmental concerns must be addressed.
Well, I think that's a really important issue, and I think one of the problems is that other parties will address environment through their environmental policy, but they won't address it through their economic policy. Every other party in this election is saying what we need in order to get our economy working in this province is more growth. We need to consume more resources, we need to produce more products at an increasing rate, about 4% per year increasing. And that's sort of assuming that the circumference of the Earth is increasing, that somehow there will be more trees to cut down next year, and that by 2020 we'll be taking 50% more fish out of the sea and cutting down 50% more trees. And that's not reality. And so we're advancing an economic platform that has got a very different basis than what other parties are advancing. And I think, sure, we could work in other parties and get our parks policy adopted, or perhaps get our forest tenure policy adopted, but being able to have our economic policy adopted, I think, is something that would be beyond the capacity of the NDP or Liberals to adopt.
Can you balance, though, the economy and the environment?
Well, I think the environment is the economy, and the economy is basically what we do in our environment. And in my view, I don't think it's a matter of balancing them as though they're two separate issues. What we have to do is build an economy, build different local economies throughout the province that are founded on sane environmental principles. One of the things that really surprises people about us is that if we're in rural BC, we say, well, of course the forest industry is the most important industry in your community because you're surrounded by trees, and we have to build an economy here that's based on using that wealth. And rather than the traditional perspective that people often think of environmentalists with, that somehow we should be moving away from wooden homes, we should be moving toward vinyl siding or other such things. And I think that the Green Party is putting forward economic policies that will sustain communities in the long term.
Okay, I come from an area that relies heavily on resources for jobs, mining, fishing, forestry. One of your policies is to preserve resources and jobs for the future. Are those two things compatible?
Well, they'd better be compatible, otherwise BC is going to be in a great deal of trouble. We're going to be in a real mess. I think they are compatible, and so we're talking about ways of creating jobs in the fishing sector and the forest sector rather than just accepting that there'll be fewer jobs there next year. And one of the things that frustrates me, and I'm glad you mentioned a whole series of industries, is when we talk about preserving jobs right now, everybody thinks we mean forestry jobs. Mm-hmm. And often those forestry jobs are preserved at the expense of hunting jobs or trapping jobs or fishing jobs. And I think that's a really significant concern. We've got to make sure that everybody on the land base is operating there on an equal footing. And I think that we can reduce the allowable annual cut in this province and increase the number of jobs. There are a huge number of people who were trained as fallers during the 1980s and 1970s in the forests.
Stuart, did you have a background in the NDP also?
Yes, I've been involved in the NDP. We have people working on our campaign who are on the executive of a local federal Reform Party constituency organization. We've got people who, we've got 2 candidates who were both very active in the BC Liberals.
Why then did you leave the NDP venue to start into the Green Party?
Well, I think there were a number of different things that attracted me to the Green Party. Well, I think the final straw, of course, is never what attracts you to something, but what repels you from something else. And when I was in the NDP, there was a provincial convention where we all voted to oppose the Meech Lake Constitutional Accord. And the caucus looked at our vote, which was overwhelming, and they all voted for the accord, with the exception of Darlene Marzari, who was, during her first term, she was the MLA that I had worked for. And I found that if you're a political party and you can't control your caucus, if you can't make sure that they're enacting the policies that you've worked at in conventions, the policies that are supported by your members, then the political party label becomes less and less important, and a party becomes hostage to pollsters and lobbyists and bond rating agencies.
Mr. Parker, you talk about that policies. I have a question about your policies. My understanding is the Green Party advocates the rights to a clean environment. Okay, and many other good things relating to the natural environment. I have a little bit, and you call that a right,
yes,
to the people, and I have a little bit different view to that. And the way I see it is that there's so many things we want from the earth, and some of them are conflict with each other, and I believe the clean environment is our responsibility. The reason I want to make the distinction between the rights and responsibility is that to discharge the responsibility, you require efforts and it costs money. And the implication of it's a right seems to imply that it's doing it at all cost. And that concerned me.
Well, one of the reasons we put in the idea of having an environmental bill of rights and people having a right to clean air, clean water, uncontaminated food is because we think that it's not enough for people just to expect their government to defend their environment for them. And so we want to return to people the opportunity to go into the courts or go through other avenues to make sure that they can act as advocates for their own environment. And that's a key part of our platform. We believe in empowering individuals and empowering communities. And I think you're right. I think it is a responsibility. And but in terms of legislation, we decided the best way to empower communities to keep logging out of their drinking watersheds would be to confer on each person in that community the right to clean water.
But Stuart, we have this now. We have many groups that are working diligently to assure that these things are happening.
That's right, and they need better tools in order to work with that.
What better tools?
And, well, I think one example is, let's look at the tools that they've lost recently. Right now, if you launch a private prosecution under the Fisheries Act in this province, this is what the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union did recently. They launched a private prosecution against the Greater Vancouver Regional District for pumping sewage into Georgia Strait that was unacceptable. And they were going to win that prosecution. And so what the Provincial Ministry of Environment did was they took over that prosecution, they turned it into a public prosecution, and they dropped the charges. And what we want to make sure of is that people can use the courts to fight for their environmental rights. And I think that that can only be positive, because you can look at the fact that more people will be involved, that people will look, I think people will look less to government, and it might even reduce government spending on this issue.
Well, let's talk about education and your policy on language programs for First Nations people, and I think that's really good, but there's no mention of programs for other ethnic groups. Well,
I'm sorry that everybody here has got the abridged version of the platform. We have a 22-page big green book, and one of the things we talk about is, especially within Greater Vancouver, offering programs in Punjabi and Cantonese and Mandarin. Those are priorities, and one of the things that I think is really important is we have to work not just through the education system, but different levels of government have to work together. Right now we have some municipal governments who are doing good work on providing services in other languages. And I think if provincial governments cooperated with them, we could have a situation where more services would be accessible in people's native languages, and at the same time there'd be some reduction in costs, that people could go to a single front end, a single office that's operating in Cantonese, and that office can act as an interface for them that is dealing with different parts of government that they would have to be dealing with separately.
Okay, then also how would your community boards work for education? Would that be similar to the health boards that are set up now?
Well, all we're talking about with the community boards for education is we're talking about expanding the authority of school boards so that they include community colleges rather than just dealing with secondary and elementary education. And one of the reasons for that is there's a lot of overlap right now between grade 12 equivalency and adult basic education services. There's a real mishmash between some communities. Both the community college and the school system are offering those programs, and those could mesh a lot better. So that's, and also I think community colleges should be community colleges and controlled by the community.
So would the university colleges fit in that model as well?
At this point, we're really unsure about the university colleges, because there's some like Malaspina that really act like community colleges, and there's some like Caribou colleges that really act like universities. And unfortunately, when you have these two words that don't really agree with each other stuck together, there are problems like that. So we don't know right now how to deal with the university colleges, but the universities are definitely a provincial institution, and we keep them under provincial jurisdiction.
Could I ask, oh, sorry. Could I ask you about just quickly, the population cap that you talk about in here? I know it's the abridged version, on the Okanagan. Would that mean that if your party somehow did get elected, that I wouldn't be able to move to the Okanagan? Like, are you talking about infringing the freedom of movement, or?
No, what we're talking about is, I realize the word population cap is there. We've since found a nicer way of putting it, which is zoning holiday. Right now, one of the reasons that we keep increasing the density of our communities and the populations in our communities is not because it's happening naturally, but because there are municipal councils all over the province that are zoning undeveloped land as low-density residential, and they're taking medium and low-density residential and turning it into high-density residential. And what we would like to see is, until we're able to audit the ecological carrying capacity of the Fraser Valley, Eastern Vancouver Island, and the Okanagan, we'd like to see a cap on zoning, so that municipalities would have about an 18-month to 2-year holiday of not being able to increase the total density. Now, there would probably still be population increases due to more families concentrating in particular areas and secondary suites and things like that. But I think we could dramatically slow the rate of growth while we audited what level of population these regions can sustainably carry while we're doing that, because it's very hard to audit something that's in a constant state of flux. And obviously people in the Okanagan recognize their water table is falling and other problems. Yes?
I would vote for the NDP, and I think I will. One of the things that they stand out most for me in comparison to other parties is the environmental record. And for me, the NDP has done so much in terms of protecting our environment.
Could you give me an example?
Well, let's just go on about this. The thing is, you just mentioned before, and it's really interesting that you're saying that environmental concerns are quite adequately covered by the existing parties, with the exclusion of your party, that is, which is, I believe, will be much more. Why are you saying that when a lot of people would come out and say, well, that's not quite the case?
Well, as I said, other parties' policies, and as I had mentioned before, one of the big problems is that parties don't enact their policies. What they do is they do what their caucus wants to do rather than what their membership wants them to do. And the NDP is full of people of conscience who have put forward and developed some really great policies, not just on the environment. Our big concerns, and one of the reasons I think that we do better in rural BC than we do in urban BC, is that there have been a lot of very cosmetic changes to environmental policy that the NDP has been involved in. To give you an example, there's the Forest Practices Code. And Mo Sahota, I was debating him on radio, and he said the great thing about the Forest Practices Code is it protects around spawning streams up to 50 meters of forest. And I said, but the word is up to, isn't it? Because in fact, the Forest Practices Code doesn't actually legislate any minimum amount of forest next to spawning streams that you protect. It puts that at the discretion of the district forest manager. And in fact, what we've seen is the Forest Practices Code is a document that's 21 years old. It was written in the dying days of the Barrett government, and it was written as a piece of advice to district forest managers of how to do things if you wanted to be really environmentally concerned.
Well,
and I
could
think that
I could see some of your concern about the issue of party line that stops a lot of people, like you say, with a lot of conscience to bring out changes. But I was just interested in your comment that the environmental policies by other parties are quite adequate in this election campaign.
Well, I think I think a lot of the other parties are putting forward changes that they would like to see, that I think we would support. The NDP are, although Glenn Clark has flip-flop on this a bit, they've said, okay, we may address tenure in our next term. The Liberals have said, well, we have this living rivers policy that they keep hauling out and showing to people. I think that the problem is that where a policy actually conflicts with an economic direction a government wants to take, there's a problem. And so the NDP has got this great policy on global warming gases, that they believe that there should be a 20% reduction in the amount of global warming gases we produce in BC. And they put that in their policy and they said, this is what we're running on. The problem is that they're expanding the Burrard thermal generating plant by 60%. The problem is they're actually increasing every year the number of global warming gases they're putting in.
Then how do we learn to trust anybody? You've just said that that policy went in, what is it, how many years ago? The suggested policy by the Barrett government. Why hasn't anybody acted on that? Why, when the that group came back in again, did they not follow up on it? We're wasting so much time.
Well, they actually did move the document from being a piece of advice to being a piece of legislated advice. And I agree. I think there are really serious problems with the way our electoral system works, and that's why we want to move toward a proportional representation system, where the vote of the members of a party convention, can actually tell the caucus what to do. And I think it would cause people to be a lot less cynical about party politics and actually get involved in political parties, because they, with their one vote in a party convention, could actually change things and affect what their caucus was doing, rather than people getting involved in a party and hoping to move up the ladder until they can get a government appointment and make changes. So I think with a proportional representation system, you can solve some of that.
But no wonder people have become cynical about it, because just as you're saying now, there were two parties coming back in and really not moving at all fast on this subject.
Yes, I'd agree there, and I think that people should look to, rather than which leader is most trustworthy, which individual is most trustworthy, they should look to how a party is going to change the system to make itself more accountable. And one of the concerns that we have with the Reform Party is that they talk about free votes in the legislature, and the United States has gone down that road. And we see the American Senate and the American Congress, where instead of having party whips calling the shots, we have various lobbyists calling the shots.
I'm pleased to find out you're not a single-issue party, which I think has been a common perception amongst the electorate in British Columbia. And I like what I hear you say in large degree. But when it comes to the enactment of what you want to do, Stuart, you have to deal with those people in government who make their living as bureaucrats. Now, how are you going to take care of what you want to do versus the way that they have it as a status quo and any changes you want to make? How are you going to take care of that?
Well, it's not just going to be the bureaucrats. I can see myself being really unpopular with international bond rating agencies, forest companies, and you name it. And I think that is a significant problem. One of the reasons that we want to get some Greens into the legislature this time is so that we can get a better sense of what it is like inside the system and how the system works, because I think that the job of governing and the job of being in opposition are very different. And often we have the best debaters and the most effective polemicists who do really well in opposition, and so we promote them to government. And
the other part of it that I find interesting, because there's an underlying really strong philosophical thread to what you're looking at, the preservation of the environment. Given that we know that the Earth is a finite place, is what you're talking about really just delaying the inevitable? It isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when?
Oh, well, that's very apocalyptic. I have no idea. I'm not a scientist. We listen to scientists, and there are some scientists who have different levels of hope right now about what's going on this planet.
Well, some things are regenerative and some are not.
I think that there are concerns, certainly, that we may have overstepped our bounds, and who knows by how much we're over-consuming. Certainly by the current rate of the ozone deficit and whatever else, we can find that there are certain planetary resources that seem to be disappearing.
Well,
but I'm hopeful.
Time is disappearing, I'm afraid. And that's my cue to, again, have the most unpleasant role of all, and that is to say our time is up. But Stuart Parker, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. It's been fun. I enjoyed this.
Good. We'll be back in just a moment to hear our voters' impressions of their conversation with Stuart Parker. Hope you'll stay with us. Well, this is a little innovation we have been doing in each of our voters' forums, and that is after the leader has departed from the studio, we ask our voters what were their impressions. Let me ask you this question first of all. Having heard what you heard, are there any of you here who would like to see a Green in the legislature?
I would.
I would too.
It's unanimous.
Yeah.
You'd all like to see a Green in the legislature. But would you vote Green?
If I lived in Stuart's riding, I would vote for Stuart.
I think their leader should get in, because there are a lot of issues in terms of, well, even health, and they're not just a single issue party, like I think a lot of us had the impression they were, but their ideas on health and education are really good in terms of college boards and a lot of prevention, instead of dealing with acute illnesses like we've seen the other parties. And so if we did have someone like Stuart in the legislature, I think other people would have to be more accountable.
Okay.
Or at least the issues would be high profile.
Some other thoughts?
I think the Green Party, for the role they're playing in our political forum now, I think they're doing a good job. A lot of good ideas. And for his age, at 24, I think it's very impressive for the knowledge and express himself.
But they have a role during election campaigns. I guess the question is, they think that they also have a role in the legislature during the period and term of a government. What do you think?
I think as opposition, they have a very definite role. You know, much of the concern that he has, I think we all have, and you need somebody as an advocate for that. Cannot really be part of one of the conventional parties because they'd never be allowed to do it. I'd be reluctant to see them as government.
One of the problems they have is that people consider them a fringe party, that people don't take them seriously. Do any of you, have you changed your perception by what you've heard tonight from Stuart Parker?
I think the Green Party should or must be taken seriously, because I think they brings a lot of ideas. I think many things that voters are longing for, and I think that they should be there. And I agree with many people here who believe that we should have some members of the Green Party in the Parliament.
All right. Thank you all very much. Tomorrow night, we're going to be back talking to the 6th leader in our series, and that, of course, is Reform Leader Jack Weisgerber. That's tomorrow night at 9:30. Hope you'll join us again for the 6th and final of our voters' forums leading up to the vote on May 28th. Reform Leader Jack Weisgerber. Good night.